So the next panel that we've got is about charities working overseas. And unfortunately, our Director of Registration, Jess Maury, couldn't be here today. So I've jumped in to moderate this. I feel very lucky. I've got a pretty amazing panel here. I'll introduce them to start with and then we'll get underway. Matthew Maury, I'm going to start with you. You're the CEO of ACFID. For those who don't know, ACFID is the Australian Council for International Development, which is a peak body for Australian non-government organisations involved in international development and humanitarian action. Matthew, I feel really grateful that you're here. You've got 30 years of experience in the sector and some pretty impressive work. You've been working with charities and NGOs across Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Pacific. You've sat on boards for a long time, including the board of Micro Australia and Make Poverty History. You also led the inaugural, you were the inaugural chair, of the Emergency Action Alliance. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate that. Andrew Colvin, it is great to have you here as well. You're the CEO of Red Cross at the moment, but of course the previous commissioner for the AFP as well. You've got an incredible background in public service. I remember you leading the National Bushfire Recovery Agency after the Black Summer in 1920. But in addition to that, I've got your bio here. You've got an amazing amount of experience working both in public service and as a partner in Deloitte. At the Red Cross, you are part of the Red Crescent Society around the world, which is a very well-known charity here in Australia, but also has 16 million volunteers around the world. So I'm excited to hear your perspectives today. Thank you. Michael Bergmann from DFAT. I've been in government long enough that I talk in acronyms now. Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, of course. Now, DFAT works with non-government organisations every day to share knowledge and information when developing policy, and you collaborate on program design and implementation as well. Michael, you're the NGO Programs and Partnerships team leader, and you've got an incredible background. You've been working at DFAT and in public policy, both in Canberra, but also in Washington, Jakarta, and across the Pacific. So thank you for being here. And last but not least, Katherine Wilson from AUSTRAC. AUSTRAC's one of those organisations that people sort of know about or they don't know about, Katherine. So the notes I've got here, and please correct me if I'm wrong because I'm bad at explaining financial things. I'm usually not allowed to. But AUSTRAC performs a dual role of Australia's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing work. You're the regulator and you have a financial intelligence unit. Now, Katherine, you've been working in financial analysis for a number of years, but you've also previously worked at the US Defence Intelligence Agency before you came to Australia, and you've worked in New South Wales Police. So I've got a few questions here that I'm excited to get into, but thank you for being here as well. Now, the reason that we wanted to hold this panel was because there's a lot of conflict in the world at the moment and growing risk of natural disasters. And we know that charities play a really important role there. We know that charities have to balance that drive to respond quickly, which is really important, with an incredible set of risk to manage alongside that. So I've got some questions about that. Andrew, I think I'd love to hear from you about key risks faced by charities and maybe the framing of why this is a really important topic.
Yeah, look, that's on. Yep. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation today. It's great to see a full room, and I know there's a lot of people online as well. I think the reality is it's a very volatile environment out there globally, and as well we have our challenges here in Australia in terms of a changing climate and humanitarian needs. And the reality is, I think we live in a world where there's more humanitarian need right now, today, than we've probably ever seen. There are more conflicts than we've seen, certainly in our lifetime. That's state actors and non-state actors alike. There's a lot of new players in the space, and there's probably less money available for a range of reasons. So it's a volatile environment, and I think we're also, from the Australian Red Cross perspective, and you mentioned we're part of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. You'll hear us talk a lot about breakdown of those international norms that we've come to expect and to work under for the last 80 odd years. And what that really means, I think, for organisations like Australian Red Cross and like many others, is the scaffolding that sits around the way we do what we do overseas, the way we provide aid, the way we move donated money around is under threat and a little bit more challenged than it's ever been before. There's a speed of volatility that we're dealing with. And we've got to weigh that up, of course, with a couple of things. One is maintaining trust in our business. Trust is absolutely critical and can be eroded very quickly. But also balancing that with the fact that we are humanitarian organisations at our core. We have hundreds of thousands of people in the movement globally who are driven to provide support and aid to people in need, and they will find ways to do that. And they will find ways to do that despite the challenges. So for organisations that need to maintain trust, we need to stick within the rules, the scaffolding. Right now, that's probably a really difficult environment and a volatile environment that we're operating in.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really great framing. I'm going to ask all four of you this question, and Katherine, I'm going to start with you. From your perspective and the space that you're working in, what do you see as the key risks faced by charities who are working overseas or sending funds overseas?
Thank you. Coming from the financial regulator, one of the financial regulators, I have a much more financing perspective, and for us, the risk lies primarily in who your partner is on the other end and what their risks might be. And so you run the risk of funds being diverted for other uses, for possible terrorist activity or support of a terrorist organization. But then also there would be the risks of your partners on the other end, the risk of fraud or possibly theft of what you've been sending over there. And it really just lies within that, that partner that you have on the other end that you might be sending funds to. I would also add that there's, again, noting that it is quite a changing space and a dynamic space. There's the risk, and we know that terrorist organizations have set up sham charities, so if you're working with another charity overseas, making sure that that's, to the best of your knowledge, that it's legitimate, that it's actually performing charitable work.
It's really helpful. From your perspective, Michael, what do you say that's maybe a little bit different or can build on that?
Yeah, thanks. I think I've sort of been collecting these thoughts under sort of three main headings. One around financial and compliance, so Katherine's covered that really nicely, but I'll just make an extra point there. I think also the areas that we're going to be working on, particularly in humanitarian crisis-affected locations, the speed is always paramount, and we've just got to make sure that the speed isn't compromising our other systems and processes that are required to ensure not just compliance, but also, as Andrew was saying, trust as well. So that's sort of the first heading around financial and compliance risks that are perennial. We've also got sort of the reputational and ethical risks, and that goes to, again, what Andrew was saying around not just compliance, but public trust. And from a DFAT perspective, I'll say it's not just public trust amongst the Australian community, but the communities we're working with overseas. And ensuring the reputation of your organisation, but also of Australia as a whole across our region and with our partner countries is paramount. So that's another key risk. But probably the main one would be around contextual, so operational and security risks in the areas that we're working with, and that's really key to knowing the countries you're working with, knowing the communities, knowing the contexts, and understanding that a lot of the settings you may be working in are fragile, conflict affected, so you may be working in areas where the infrastructure is not as anticipated, the communications systems may be compromised, so getting information about partners and about the areas you're going to be working with will be more difficult. So I think those are the sort of three main headings I would group them under.
Thanks, Michael. And building on that from an operational perspective, Matthew, I suspect you've got some great insight there.
Yeah, I'll pick up on a couple of the themes that Andrew and Michael have touched on, and one of which is the rapidly changing context and the unique complexity of each of the different contexts. And for many charities who work overseas, their boards, they might think of their risk management framework as kind of one for all, and there really is a need to be thinking, even at the project community level, what are the unique risks and challenges facing that community, and how do we mitigate those? If you look at the human side of risk, or the people side of things, 2024 was the deadliest year on history for humanitarian workers. And that's not just in conflict situations. The risks have continued to grow. So boards need to be thinking about in their legal responsibilities with work health and safety and duty of care. How do you prepare? How do you protect? How do you take care of the staff and volunteers that might be engaged with your programs? How do you think about the psychosocial impacts as well? And that's not just for people who are going to be working or living overseas in those contexts. Certainly what I've seen over the years is a lot of the psychosocial challenges are actually even the people who might be sitting in an office here and just seeing the images or reading the stories or doing the social media. So thinking holistically about how you manage those concerns and those risks for your team are really important, as well as the protection of vulnerable people against sexual abuse and harassment, which is an area where we know in a volatile world and a rapidly changing situation, those risks are heightened. So thinking about how do you ensure that you have appropriate frameworks in place is really important.
Thanks very much. Andrew, do you want to comment on that as well?
Look, I think we've covered most of it. I'm glad Michael said what he did about making sure that we're thinking through the protection of individuals, because that's obviously the number one concern for us and boards. The Red Cross, Red Crescent movement gives us some ability to draw on experiences of others. So we have a natural advantage in that regard, that there's 191 of us around the world, plus the ICRC, and we're convened by a federation. That gives us that due diligence that I think you've heard before. It gives us the ability to make sure we know who we're working with, and that is so critical, as you've heard, in an environment that's changing daily, literally.
I think what you've all said is that there is a rapidly changing environment, and I don't think that that's going to slow down anytime soon. I want to talk a little bit more about emerging risks and what you're seeing, and I'm probably interested, Matthew, from you. What does that look like? I think one of the things that we talked about in advance is misinformation. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think that is one of the new and perhaps emerging areas, especially with the ways that social media and technology is being used in AI for that matter, is the spread of misinformation, the use of misinformation to decredit or target humanitarian work, charities, governments, and of course others as well. We're seeing that more and more in conflict situations or where things are in a rapidly polarizing world, how disinformation is being used in ways that can target and discredit charities. We know that in some countries, governments will use that sort of information to control registration, to control flow of funds, and to control the agenda and the direction that aid flows. We certainly have seen some of those new challenges in the Middle East and in Gaza in particular of late. Another emerging risk that I just wanted to mention or challenge is and this is a flow-on effect, and it might be interesting to hear Katherine's reflections on this, but it's a flow-on effect that most boards are very aware of the need to manage risks. And there actually is a risk that you kind of go to either extreme. And one is that there are charities who are just then boards who are naive about the complexity and the risks, and they get involved in international work without really understanding the context or the work that needs to be done. There's the other extreme where it all just feels too hard and too risky, and so we back away and we don't engage. And I think there is a medium, and that we'll talk about some of the ways that boards can be best positioned and organizations can position to ensure that good work does continue. But I think that as we're thinking about those risks and those challenges, one of the challenges that some of our members have found is that, for instance, the banking sector has, in their effort to de-risk, has made the decision not to work with charities where it's easier to say no than to say yes. And that's created some complexity in terms of moving funds and being able to continue operations. So I know that's not the goal of legislation, that's not the goal of some of the risk management, but that is a challenge that, and a new emerging challenge for charities who are thinking about working internationally.
So building on that, Katherine, I'd love to talk to you. So AUSTRAC is responsible for the national risk assessment around terrorism financing in Australia. And charities certainly have experienced different controls around banking and moving money, as Matthew said. From your perspective, is that risk changing, or is it staying the same and just continuing to need maintenance?
Thank you. Hello? The last time, yep, ready. So the last time we did actual dedicated risk assessment for nonprofits was back in 2017. And we actually have just now started our updated risk assessment for that. But when we did the National Risk Assessment for Terrorism Financing, which is on our website, there is a section actually dedicated to nonprofits and charities that looks at it. And I suppose the good news and the bad news out of that is that the risks haven't really changed. Those risks of diversion, of fraud, and theft persist. The terrorist threat continues to endure, and whether it's established organizations and large ones like Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, or the smaller ones, they continue to exploit the financial resources that they can in any way they can.
And I suspect, Katherine, you're going to say that due diligence is really important for charities in managing risk.
Yes.
Is there anything else you would build on that?
Not really. I mean, what really comes to mind for me is this, that know your customer concept that the financial institutions have, and those concepts and that identification and mitigation and management of risk that you can achieve by knowing your customer, which is to say, you don't, as you said, Matthew, you're not stepping aside from it, you're not ignoring it, but you're knowing it and you're making an informed decision as to whether it's worth the risk.
Michael, can I ask you for your views on how charities could manage that risk as well?
Oh, absolutely. No, I think, not wanting to steal any of Matthew's thunder, I think it is a lot of the peer learning that goes on amongst the sector. I think ACFID plays a really important role in bringing the sector together. Chances are there is someone working in the sector that you may be interested in, the country that you may be interested in partnering, who have some deep local knowledge, if you don't. The peer learning environment that ACFID can pull together. And of course DFAT as well. Our missions and posts are very politically astute, with people on the ground, and are always happy to talk to Australian organisations who are looking at working in their areas of interest.
Great, and it's one thing to talk about government resources and support, but Matthew and Andrew, you both have long careers sitting on boards of charities and managing charities, so I'm interested in your perspectives on what works in terms of managing that risk. Matthew, I might start with you.
Yeah, I think about that kind of in three broad areas. One is the role of the board and an effective board, and we have talked about some of those themes, but something we haven't mentioned that I'll talk about, and I think it's one of the sessions later today, is around the diversity of the board and how powerful that is in helping a board to govern well and to manage risk. For many of our members, what we have seen over the years is the increased representation of diaspora community members, and just general diversity on their board. So they actually have a better way of thinking through the context that they're working in, and thinking through risk and opportunities as well, not just the negative side of operations. So strong governance structures and strong systems, as well as boards that are thinking regularly about reviewing their strategic plan. I'm yet to meet a CEO in the sector in the last few months who hasn't said that they're reviewing their strategic plan. There have been such massive changes, and the need to have a current strategy and to be thinking about, is it fit for purpose, and all of our systems still fit for purpose. Michael's mentioned the ACFID. ACFID has a code of practice. It's really seen as a gold standard actually globally in terms of international charity operations. It lays out a full framework of what good looks like. It's a great guidance for charities. Any member of ACFID has to be compliant with that code, but the code's freely available to any charity who wants to see what does good look like, and what does good governance mean for our operations as we work overseas. The last thing I'll mention is another trend that's, I think, really grown over the last few years, and this is this idea of locally led or localization, and thinking about how do we actually make the most of local partners, local NGOs, civil society in the places that we operate to really speak into not just the risk management, that's the focus of our discussion, but really effective programming and impact on the ground. So thinking through those three areas, I think, are really important.
A couple of things. Yes, we are reviewing our strategic plan, which is common because, nothing can be static in this environment. So if you're not constantly updating and amending your governance, your rules, your regulations, your plans, then you're falling behind. I think boards play a really critical role here, and from an Australian Red Cross perspective, we are literally, as of 1st of July, just moved from a member-based board to a skills and capability-based board, largely as a reflection of the fact that the environment around us is very complicated and that we need to bring in specific skills onto our board to make sure we are managing these risks appropriately. There's something else that goes on here, and the ACNC has been very good at helping all charities and all organisations in the sector understand that it costs money to do this. And just because you're a charity doesn't mean that everything you get has, we would love for every 100% of every cent that comes into Australian Red Cross to go towards on-the-ground delivery of services. But there's a reality that we need to build capability frameworks that provide trust, that when somebody is giving money to an organisation, that they can be confident that it's free from fraud and corruption risk, or that it is going to go to the right partner. So I think there's a lot that charitable sector needs to do. And I guess the other point I would make here is we're not islands. I think we have probably operated as islands a little, and ACFID play a really important role here in convening the sector so that we are leveraging each other. There's individual strengths and there's individual experiences that we can all learn from. I said at the start that it's a competitive market to a degree. It's a busy market. There's new players coming into the humanitarian sector all the time. That's important. I think competition is good because it makes everybody better, but we need to get better at actually putting aside some of that competition and acting as a sector, particularly, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, when we're talking to government and we're talking to our partners overseas about how we should be operating.
It's almost as if you knew what my next question was,
That's a good segue, wasn't it?
It was a great segue, so I might actually throw to you, from your perspective, what opportunities are there for government to better support charities in this space?
Yeah, so I want to say right up front, and not just because I have a DFAT colleague on the table, I think government is doing a good job here. There is, and not just at the Commonwealth level, I think at the state and territory level, there is an increased interest in things like volunteering, an increased interest in the charitable sector, how money is raised, how money is used, and that's really important because the first thing we need to do is have awareness and shine sunlight into this area because that's how we all learn, that's how we all grow. Of course, you would expect me to say this, and I will say this, I would love for government to move a little bit quicker on some of the recommendations of various parliamentary committees and reviews, because I think the recommendations are sound, I think they're very good. I've been on the other side of the fence, so I know how hard it can be to change legislation, and I know how hard it can be to find that right balance, but I think the answers are in there. I think there is, humanitarian exemptions are something that we, along with many others in the sector, have been asking for and calling for. But it needs to be done in a sensible and responsible way. It's not just a blanket exemption. It's not just carve it all out and go your hardest charities. Of course not. So I think there's more that we can do in that space. But, I think the narrative, or not think, I know that the narrative that has come out of government recently is very positive, very constructive. And, I think we've just got to continue to speak as much as we can with one voice. ACFID, again, play a very important role from that, because I know from the other side, if you're government and you're getting 300 views on the same piece of legislation, it's very hard to find a way through that. So we need to be a bit smart about the way we engage government.
Thanks for that. Katherine, Michael, I'm going to give you a right of reply in a moment, but Matthew, I might just ask you, is there anything you want to build on that wish list?
I think one of the things that I hear regularly, and any of you who are involved with charities will have that pain of compliance and that sense that compliance requirements have continued to go up. So I think regular review to make sure that we have things pitched at the right level. I'm really pleased that we have a strong history with ACFID working with the ACNC in terms of trying to align standards and recognize where the ACFID code, what it does, looking at the external conduct standards that the ACNC has, and working as much as possible to bring alignment. And so I think there's always an opportunity as compliance continues to grow to think about how do we manage these things in a way that gets it at the right level and ensures efficiency across the board. A couple of specific things I'll mention. I've already mentioned the challenge of, for instance, banks de-risking and not working with NGOs. Anything government can do to make the banking sector and other formal financial institutions understand that the regulator can be comfortable when there's good practices in place for the sector, and so that can provide some protection and guarantees for the sector. So that would be one idea. The other thing that would be fantastic would be, as we do terror screening and all of our members really take that seriously and have a high standard for that, to look to the government to help to create a system or one point of contact that NGOs and charities could go to track that. Right now they have to find their own pathway, and there could be some real efficiencies gained if government helped provide a source for that.
Katherine, I might ask you to comment on that.
With regards to the banks and their choice for de-risking, I will note, AUSTRAC we take the right of banking quite seriously and that it's important. And we also recognize, though, that the banks have their own risk management profiles to handle, and they have the costs that go along with their risks. To do our part to try to address that, we did in 2023, we released a guidance on debanking, de-risking, that tries to spell out for our regulated populations what our expectations are in terms of managing risk under the Anti-Money Laundering and Counterterrorism Financing Act, that for us, and also encouraging. It was written more for remittance agencies and the like, but also encouraging transparency and so that everybody goes into that risk decision fully informed, both from the customer's perspective as well as the bank's perspective. But unfortunately, it is fundamentally their business decision about what risk they're going to manage. And as their regulator, we can't tell them how to run their business. Sorry.
That's pretty fair, Matthew.
Sorry, I will just add though, but I do think also the risk assessments that we did in 2017, specifically for the nonprofit organization sector, and updating that now together with the ACNC is another step that we're taking so that, the public generally, but also our regulated population understands how we perceive the risk.
I was almost going to skip you, Michael, but I've decided that I shouldn't. You talked a bit about partnership. Anything to add?
Well, just to respond, I think basis of the question about what can government do, I think us at DFAT sometimes we'll come at that from a slightly different perspective, in the sense it's not just Australian charities or our little NGO sort of acronym as well, CSOs that we work with. We're of course working with civil society organisations and NGOs across the world. To build on the previous discussion, we're also looking at how we can encourage more what we call locally led development, so localisation of approaches, working directly with local partners. So a lot of the efforts we're doing, as well as trying to improve standard settings, code of conducts, accreditation processes, external standards, all of those, of course, focused with Australian organisations in mind. We've also got a very forward-looking, I should say, I would hope, I think I can say, approach to dealing with local partners, building the capacity of local organisations. A lot of our reviews that we've done just keep pointing to this. We have a program called the Australian Humanitarian Program. There was a review recently, and it was very clear that the effectiveness of working through local partners, investing in local capacity, local leadership will deliver more sustainable and context-sensitive interventions, and that reduces operational risk for us as a department. We're also doing a lot of work on the safety of individuals. So our Foreign Minister Wong is really progressing the declaration on the protection of humanitarian personnel. So again, as government, what we can do, of course, is work with our counterpart governments, work with the multilateral system to try and build up those systems and really back in humanitarian law around the protection of personnel who are out there working in the field. To touch on some of the things Matthew was saying, and Andrew as well, around, there are a lot of really good recommendations that have come out of multiple reviews and reports and parliamentary committees. One of the things I'll touch on, because it does get raised, often I might be preempting a question here, is around funding. We understand that predictable and flexible funding really goes a long way to support Australian organisations working with their partners. It helps build those relationships, those long-term partnerships, so you're not out there searching for new partners. You can build up a long-term relationship with organisations in the field. So we're looking at ways that we can support that. One of the programs we've got that does support Australian charities, Australian NGOs, is the Australian NGO Cooperation Program. That program itself, yes, it has annual-based funding, but the program has been going for 50 years, 50 years. So there's a lot of long-term engagement that we are able to support through that program. Are we able to tweak some of our systems and processes so that the funding itself is more predictable? We can, yes, and we're working with the sector to improve that as well. I'll just touch on one other thing I think that I failed to mention when we were talking about the risks. We did talk about contextual risks in the environment we're working in. We recognise that civic space itself is shrinking across and is under threat right across the world. And as civic space itself, of course, being the operating environment, as it were, that civil society organisations will work in, and the government's looking at supporting through a civil society partnerships fund mechanisms to support organisations who are also themselves looking to defend and expand civic space, so the operational environment in which we're working in.
It's really important work. Thank you for that. Now I'm going to time keep myself. I'm going to throw to Tim. Tim, are there any questions coming through Slido?
I might just ask a question. How can charities continue to manage risks when local standards in overseas locations differ from expectations in Australia? I might start with probably Andrew, if you've got any insights on that.
Yeah, look, thank you. I mean, I think risk is the lens through which all of this discussion today is seen through at the end of the day. And unless we want to exit the humanitarian aid space, we can't de-risk this to the point that we can't act and operate. So charities, I'm sure I can speak on behalf of other charities, I probably can't, but I'm sure it will be the case that everybody has very robust risk frameworks in place. And the Australian Red Cross has a very robust risk framework in place that would be the equivalent and match any organisation out there. I know I'm talking to probably a room full of legally trained people, so I don't want to get too deep into that. But that risk framework has to also have an external aspect to it as well. So, Australian Red Cross deploys delegates, aid, funding into some of the biggest challenges of our generation, some of the most tough environments. We have a natural advantage that we are part of a global movement, and I don't want to understate just how important that is to us, because there is a Red Cross or Red Crescent entity, society, ICRC or IFRC office in just about everywhere we're going to need to operate. So it's that due diligence, it's that on-the-ground information. It's not taking risks that you shouldn't take of working with organisations that you don't know. I think misinformation and disinformation is a real issue at the moment because misinformation is coming from sources that you may previously have felt you should have trusted. So you've got to recalibrate and retest how you get your information about local actors. Again, we have an advantage, I guess, that we have a global network that we can rely on. It's not free from risk, though.
Thanks, that's really interesting. Matthew, did you have anything to add from the ACFID perspective?
I guess to emphasize what Andrew was saying about and what Michael had mentioned as well, the importance of listening and working closely with local partners who understand the context better. And that gets back to my earlier point about diversity on your board and how you're thinking through your risk framework from a global lens.
Thanks. I might pass over to Michael.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to just add one extra point on that. I think the question, of course, can also be looked at from, a lot of organisations might be dealing with different donors, might have different requirements, not just the requirements of the country that they're working in. Of course, that's paramount. That is the legal framework. That's understanding your context and knowing what that is of course central. But we're also seeing a lot of misaligned standards with emerging donors and with other be it countries or philanthropic groups that may not quite align with what, particularly if you're receiving Australian government funding or Australian government support in any way, might be misaligned. So again, it's important to be able to navigate that. There's a lot of safeguards requirements that we have in our contracts and our grant agreements. There's a lot of requirements for inclusion and gender equality that might actually run counter to some other donors or countries that you may be operating in, but we're not going to drop ours. So again, it's something that's important to note and be able to navigate through.
Thanks, Michael. And that does lead nicely into the next question, which is probably best addressed to Matthew or Andrew. How have you seen the impacts of recent cuts to US aid trickle down to charities, and what are your future predictions?
Yeah, I could go on for a while about this, so I'll be brief. The short answer is massive for the Australian NGO landscape. We did a survey earlier this year of ACFID members It was over $300 million of programming that had been impacted for Australian NGOs alone. I was just in the Fiji 2 weeks ago talking to my counterpart, who's the head of the peak body for NGOs in the Pacific, and Piango is the name of the organization. Ciali is their director. She was sharing how many charities and how many NGOs within the Pacific have shut down instantly. Many Australian charities who've been impacted by these cuts have balance sheets, have reserves, have ways to manage through those situations. Many local organizations and partners don't, and so they have felt that pain immediately and instantly. So it has been massive, and we haven't seen the end of it because a lot of that was the direct funding impacts, but also because the U.S. government contributes close to 40% of the global aid ecosystem, or used to. They funded many of the UN systems, and taking the funding away from that is going to have a ripple impact because some of those funds get funded once a year and they haven't run out of funds yet. Talking to organizations on the Thai-Burma border, I was meeting with some representatives from Myanmar last week, and they were saying that their refugee camps on that border, the food will stop being funded this week, tomorrow, and the healthcare systems they will stop receiving funding next week. And there is no other food and there is no other healthcare system for those refugees. So massive. It's also a point in time, and I'll stop in a second, there's a point in time when Australia actually hasn't stepped back, and this is a real credit to the government that they didn't cut their aid budget at a time that actually, if you look at global funding, if you project out the next 3 years, close to up to 50% of the global overseas development spending will leave the global system. That's foreign, that's government funding. A lot of that, and we know the trends, USAID cuts is one of those, but actually the shift to spend more on defense and less on aid and humanitarian work is one of those pressures that many governments around the world are facing as well. So,
I think Matthew's covered that really well. I mean, it's not just about USAID, that's where everybody goes, but it's about the reprioritisation of government money towards things and the deprioritisation of humanitarian aid in that process. Australian Red Cross, touch wood, has been largely, we weren't as exposed to USAID funding, but our partners have been. Our partners in the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement have been, and our partners, as you've just heard, across the region have been. The bit for me the challenge for me is two things that I see. There is a long tail to this, so I can't answer the question of what do I see next because I see a long tail, and it's not just about USAID funding. I think it's about deprioritisation of humanitarian aid. But I just lost my train of thought. Well, it's the scaffolding. That's the bit that worries me. The systems and frameworks that were built up because of long histories and decades of funding into institutions, into frameworks, are starting to disappear. So that puts at risk everything that we've been talking about today.
Thank you for that. And just another question for you, probably Andrew, is you mentioned the recent transition from, I guess, member-based board to one more based off skills. How did you find the transition as a charity, and what are your tips in terms of a handover for the new, or that other charities could apply for the new board members?
Wow, that's a good question, and whoever out there has asked that question, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or something because it's a long answer. Australian Red Cross is 110 years old, so there's a lot of legacy, there's a lot of built-up expectation, there's a lot of history that sits around how we are governed. We are a member-governed entity. But I think our board had a lot of foresight a number of years ago, prompted by some events external to the organisation as well as internal, that said we've got to change the way we do this. And how do we change our governance structure without losing the heart of the organisation, which is a member-run and member-governed organisation? I think we've tread a very fine line and done a very good job. 1st of July, our new arrangements came in. It takes a lot of communication. It takes a lot of bringing people on the journey. 7,000 odd members of the Australian Red Cross around the country, 12, 14,000 volunteers. You've got to bring them on that journey with you. Our board has done an exceptional job of that. And as CEO, and I can speak on behalf of the management team as well, we are incredibly thankful, and no disrespect to our former board who are wonderful people, but a skills-based, competency-based board that has a balance of member interest as well is where we have to go because our world is sophisticated and complex.
I don't envy you on that, Andrew, having been through a similar process in a different organisation. It's not a fun one, but it's a really important one, so well done. I'm going to wrap us up. There's so many more questions that we could ask, but in the interest of time, we won't. I want to say thank you, Matthew and Andrew, for the contribution that your organisations make, and also Katherine and Michael for the work that you do to support charities. I don't think there's anyone in this room that thinks that charities don't play an important role on the world stage and should continue to. So thank you for being here today. Appreciate it. We might wrap this one up. Thank you.
Thank you.